medicine,
law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area.
Hey, Nick, how are you doing today?
Hello, Dr. Long. How are you?
Good, good. You know what I was thinking is this upcoming weekend, I'm going to be going to the Wisconsin State Fair, and I miss the Texas State Fair because isn't technically the State Fair there is the largest out of the country?
I think so. I think it's one of the largest, if not the largest.
Have you gone or have you been?
I think the only time I've actually been, I think I've been twice. One was when we were in college. I don't think you went on this trip, but we went for the Texas OU game.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the year after we went just to go to the fair. There's a part of Dallas. It's like the southern part of Dallas or southeastern part of Dallas, maybe 10 minutes from downtown. It's called Fair Park. And every year we do the Texas State Fair, and it takes place September, October-ish. So it goes for about a month. And every weekend there's concerts and shows. But one of the big things is the Texas OU football game, which is a big rivalry game. So every year you don't play in Austin and you don't play in Norman. You always play at the neutral site, which is the Cotton Bowl at Fair Park. So that's what I'm referencing when I mean I went to the game there. But the State Fair of Texas is amazing. My wife and I were actually talking about going last year, but we just couldn't make the time. So have you ever been? Did you ever get to go?
I've been once, and I wish I had gotten more opportunities to go. But I've been to the Wisconsin State Fair, which is down in Milwaukee, the last 2 years, and it's nice, it's cute. You know, you see all the farm animals, the horses, the competitions, and then you try all the different foods. But it's not the same. It's not quite the same as Texas, because Texas does crazy things, like crazy ingredients and combinations with fried. Like everything is fried.
Yeah,
I always thought that was kind of cool and interesting to try different things.
I think every year at the state fair, they have a food competition to see what is like the new fried food on the block. I know in recent years, you obviously have fried Oreos and fried Twinkies, but they've done fried beer. I think fried peaches, just fried
butter.
Everything.
Yeah, fried butter, I think.
Sticks of fried butter that were legitimate, like butter sticks that were just completely fried.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely some crazy ideas out there. But this actually kind of leads us into a really interesting topic today about new medical advances and things that we are kind of figuring out whether or not it has a place in medicine, in healthcare at all. And so our topic today is actually going to be about marijuana. We might be touching more on the medical marijuana component of it, but hopefully it can hash out kind of the legalities, how it can be to your benefit or to your detriment if it's ever needed in your health. Right, Nick?
And how, if you take medical marijuana, maybe you get hit with the munchies, which is all that good state fair food.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. So I'll hit us off, kind of go through the basics of what marijuana is. And this is just very surface level, right? So marijuana comes from a plant. It's a cannabis plant. And there's multiple components within it that you can extract those components to utilize as either an edible, whether you want to inhale it, smoke it, etc. And there are certain things that can occur, right? Effects that can happen. And so the two main ones that we're going to be talking about today is cannabidiol, which is CBD, and then these names are hard. THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol. So I'm going to use CBD and THC for short. It's so much easier. But they both come from the same plant. It's just a different component of it. So medically speaking, CBD is kind of where you see the most medical benefit without the major side effects. That's kind of what the thought process is currently with the data that we have. A THC is more of those psychoactive components. So that's where you're going to kind of have that euphoria. You're going to feel high. You're going to feel like you're floating. So that can sometimes cause more issues because depending on the person's state of mind, that may exacerbate anxiety, may exacerbate other conditions that they already have. And so again, we're going to be kind of touching base on THC, CBD. How does that fall within our society in the medical field? And hopefully we'll have a good conversation about it all.
When you're looking at those two things, and I have never really partaken in the marijuana.
Really? You were that boring, Nick?
Yeah, that boring. Again, remember, I was trying to get into the FBI, and then I went into aerospace and defense, so it definitely would have cut my career short if I had entertained that a little bit. And for the record, I don't have a problem with marijuana. It was just not something that could have been included in my career path. But when I've spoken to people about medical marijuana or even marijuana in general, there's so many different pieces of terminology that I don't understand. You know, you have your THC, you have your CBD, you have your dosages. If it's over a certain milligram, this could happen. If the THC is over a certain percent, this could happen. So I like the fact that you're kind of walking us through at least your knowledge of what those things are and how they differ.
So let's kind of bring it back to how it's medically can be used, right? So there are synthetic versions and then there are natural versions. So the THC CBD will be kind of the natural options, but we do have a synthetic version that we can utilize in the health system here in the U.S. without much issue across most states, which is called Marinol for brand name. And what it does is we usually use it in patients who have cancer or on their deathbed hospice. We're looking for them to find some appetite. Maybe it helps with some nausea, vomiting. Maybe it helps with chemotherapy side effects. And there is also actually surprisingly an indication for sleep apnea, which I was surprised to find out. But that is a man-made cannabinoid or CBD version. But when we talk about the THC, CBD, that is where we start talking about components of percentages, how much percentage of CBD, so how much percentage of THC. And so if I looked across the US, there are 40 states that actually allow for the medical use. So that's typically CBD. And then there are only 24 states that allow recreational, which is more of the THC component. There are some CBD that kind of falls into. Is that kind of what you've seen in your research?
Yeah, we'll get to the legal stuff here in a little bit, but from like a legal aspect of regulation, right, and legislation, you have states that partake in the legalization of different levels, whether it is recreational, medical, and then when you go into those individual categories, you have the limitations on the THC percents as well as how you can utilize it. So whether it's a patch or whether it's a vape or whether, you know, you're growing and smoking it. So there's a lot of different pieces of legislation out there across the 50 states as well as federally, because you have the state versus federal. But to what you're saying, that's exactly what I've come across doing my research on this. And a little fun fact, here in Texas, it looks like our governor just signed medical marijuana law, which should go into effect September 1st of 2025, and that becomes the 40th state to acknowledge the medical marijuana aspect.
I definitely think the medical use is becoming more common and accepted because, again, from a medical standpoint, from a health standpoint, we do utilize it in a lot of chronic pain, cancer pain. So you're thinking about your grandpa, grandma, uncles who are struggling and you don't want them to be on opiates. This is more of a natural option. It can be used for chemo side effects. So if you're on chemotherapy, radiation, you can sometimes have a lot of nausea, vomiting, also aches and pains, anxiety, insomnia. These are all things that CBD is looking like there is some benefit for use. And I mean, I guess from a medical standpoint, when a patient is at their end of life, our goal is to make them comfortable. So if this is another tool that we have in our pocket to utilize, I say, let's take it. Are we truly going to be worried about them becoming dependent and, you know, being an addict on CBD when they're already on hospice? So I hope as we move forward that this becomes an even broader topic across everyone's conversation.
And not to put you on the spot, and I think we'll dive into this in more detail, but there are a spectrum of drugs which could be considered street drugs that have medical purposes. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, you hear of fentanyl, you hear of methamphetamines, you hear of cocaine, but it's my understanding that those all have medical uses and in some way, shape, or form can be prescribed for certain situations.
Yeah, and that's really watering down what those definitions are. But yes,
of course.
all of those street drugs do have a I guess you could say brand name or medical use for them. And they are branded under a different name in different doses, of course, and are much more regulated than what is out on the streets. But yes, you can get those. But that's also why they are very regulated when it is prescribed by a physician. So you usually have to sign a controlled substance contract with your primary care physician if this is going to be a long-term issue. If this is something that you get from the emergency room and it's only going to be for like 3 to 7 days, say you broke your arm and you need like hydrocodone or something, then there will be a very big conversation about how this can lead to addiction. And it really only just takes 1 or 2 and you get that high feeling. It's something that we used to prescribe a lot, like the older docs, the older generation used to prescribe a lot when it first came out. But obviously now we've come up with more data and research and know that it actually can sometimes be of detriment to start patients on it when it's not absolutely necessary.
It reminds me of my grandmother passed about 2 years ago, and she was in hospice in the house. And to ease the pain, the hospice nurse actually gave her fentanyl patches. And
Hmm.
so they had to put fentanyl patches on every couple of hours to keep the pain down. And then you juxtapose that against the news and media and how fentanyl itself is a problem currently in our society. So I
Mm,
think those are the kind of two very different uses of the drug. And to your point, there's regulation, there's being able to control it as a substance. But these street drugs, I'm saying that in quotes, have medicinal use. And I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that usually the drug comes from a medicinal point to begin with.
correct.
Usually that's how it begins, and then it's abused somewhere down the line.
Right, right. And, just kind of bring in relevant news, current news. Have you
Uh-huh.
seen any of the shows that have come out about like the opiate history and the family
Mhm.
that created it, and how they were sending people out to basically buy physicians and make them sell their products, or prescribe the products? I thought some of those shows were pretty darn good. The one that I
Yeah.
recently saw was Dope Sick. Have you heard of that one?
No, I've not.
Yeah. You should look into it. Pretty good.
Yeah, documentary style.
No, no, it's an actual it's got Michael Keaton in it, who plays the
Oh,
main
really?
doctor. Yeah.
You mean I'm gonna piss a lot of people off, but the real Batman? Well, let's take it on back. Keep telling me how, in your practice and in med school, like what have you seen from the category that is medical marijuana?
I think this varies across the state. Just like we know the regulations of it is different in every state. So that means depending on where you went to medical school and residency, you're going to have different exposures to marijuana and what that means in a medical versus a recreational standpoint, right? So I did medical school in Oregon. It's pretty much legalized in everything. And
Yeah.
so I got to see a lot. I got to see it prescribed. I got to see it used. And then I did residency in New Jersey, which not as open as Oregon, but still had allowed medical marijuana at that time. And so I saw the prescription of that. Now that I'm practicing in Wisconsin, it's allowed, but it's still very strict. And so technically it's still illegal from a physician standpoint. If I am prescribing any other controlled substance, we discuss like you cannot have any other things that show up in your urine drug screen, because that's something that we have to do regularly. But marijuana would absolutely be one of those that would um, cause you to break that contract, which could mean that we would, no longer prescribe, say, your Adderall or your pain
Mhm.
medication. So that's a conversation that we always have when we get into that contract. But I personally have not prescribed it much, because most people that I feel like do need it or would benefit, they tend to be the older generation, people who are closer to hospice, people who are on chemo. They are kind of almost afraid because it's something that they are not used to. I'll
Uh-huh.
try to explain to them the benefits of it and what we've seen so far in the limited data that we do have. It's actually quite hard to convince patients. They are usually more comfortable with going with the actual pharmaceuticals, the ones that have been around for some time now.
And that may lend itself to the fact that when the older generations were coming up, it was the war on drugs, the
Mhm.
horror stories of what marijuana and weed could do to your system. So there could be, to your point, a lack of understanding
Mhm.
across this generation as to how it can actually help them, just because in media and the news how detrimental they've made weed seem to your health. And so as a medical professional, I'm sure that's hard to try to get that across and explain, you are the professional, you've done the research, whatever it is out there that you can look at, and you think that this is probably a good situation for them, but they still want to shy away for something they're more comfortable with.
I think the more um, negative side of it is that I am seeing younger and younger kids get into it more commonly than the older generation. So we're talking teens, like early teens, 13, 14-year-olds who smoke daily or do edibles daily. And that do think is a little more detrimental, because we do not have the data out there to support if it's beneficial or not. I can only go based on anecdotal evidence, which is what I currently see with my patients. And the people who are smoking every day tend to be less motivated. They tend to struggle in school. But more importantly, they're usually running away from something. They're usually utilizing these medications or these drugs to remedy something that they're trying to avoid, whether that is PTSD, where there's anxiety, depression. Majority of the time, it actually backfires and goes the other way.
And it's kind of similar to, in that sense, to, let's say, alcohol.
Mhm.
So maybe in small doses, alcohol can make you more social or give you a good night, but there comes a time or a point where you might be abusing alcohol. You might be leading into alcoholism. You might be drinking so much that all of a sudden you're not showing up to work or you're not around your family. And it can be super, super detrimental to your health. And it's kind of a like all things in high school, it's a gateway. You start with one thing and then you can kind of start veering into other areas that might even be more detrimental than what you are doing initially.
And the thing that I find hard is people who have been doing these things, whether it's alcohol, whether it's hard drugs, whether it's marijuana, it's not convincing them, but enlightening them to the fact that, hey, maybe you are overusing it. You're using it more than you need to. And you've just kind of fallen into this habitual cycle where you just feel like you should be doing it every day because you've always done it every day. And that's the hardest part to talk to the patient about. There's just so many different side effects that can come from overuse of marijuana. Just to list a couple is one, it really does demotivate a lot of people, right? If you are smoking, you're usually really relaxed, so you don't want to do very much. So it can affect work life, it can work school life. Some people get really sleepy or tired or fatigued. That is not good. If you're using it long term and you're not exercising, then you could lose a lot of muscle mass. It tends to kind of spike your appetite, so it can cause some weight gain, obesity concerns, weight concerns. In rare cases, it can cause anxiety, worsening anxiety. It may make you feel more tense rather than relaxing you. Not every medication affects everyone similarly. And then if you overuse it, like if you're smoking more or eating more than you're supposed to, you can have psychosis, you can have intoxication. And that's where your mental status is completely shifted and completely changed. It's almost as if you're drunk, you're not acting in your best interest. So a lot of concerns, a lot of things that can go poorly if not utilized correctly.
And I think for our listeners, there will be some listeners on one side of the aisle that says marijuana bad, weed bad, don't ever do it. And then you have others on the other that's like it's completely safe. It's a fun thing to do. You can smoke every day. You can smoke multiple times a day or do your edibles or do your vape, and it's completely okay. I think people need to put into perspective, again, not medical advice, but I feel like that is how you would consult one of your patients. If they came to you and said, hey, I'm thinking about smoking or you're taking an edible, you would say, all right, well, here are the pros and cons of it. Because obviously with it being medical marijuana, there have been some instances of finding a pro, and we've discussed some of those. But when you talk about recreational, there can be cons there as well. And I think I appreciate the fact that you're like, hey, it's not just I'm taking this drug and I'm having this impact. It's like there are long-term side effects that can occur from you taking or doing something over and over and over and over. If you eat chocolate too much every single day, you're gonna see negative side effects from eating chocolate every single day. So I think a lot of people don't consider those things and how they might impact them in the long run, especially when it comes to like drugs and alcohol. Some people are just looking for that instant gratification, that instant euphoria, or maybe that instant feeling of curing depression or PTSD, that escapism that occurs. So I really appreciate the way that you're presenting this in a sense of you're not talking down upon it. You're just stating, hey, here are the negatives that can occur from the use of it.
Right. And that's the other thing is that just like any medication that we prescribe out there, it affects everyone differently. So each person may need a different dose. Each person may need to utilize it in a different consistency. Maybe it's not a daily use and every other day use. It's so different. And that's why it's so hard, I feel like, to legislate and to make rules for it. Because just because you think the majority of people will do fine, smoking once a day and, however much you want to do a day, doesn't mean that from the smallest person, like if it's a teenager, it can do the same amount as a 80-year-old or a 50-year-old. So it's just really hard to come up with those finite rules that everyone is looking for. Like, okay, this is a safe amount versus this is not a safe amount. Like, it's hard to distinguish that when there's such a wide range that each person can tolerate. If you just look at alcohol, right? I think college students probably can tolerate a lot more than us 30, 40-year-olds drinking. It's just the nature of it.
And you mentioned something, and I want to ask you about it because I found that one of the issues with marijuana in general, but specifically medical marijuana, is lack of research. And a lot of research comes from state grants or state funding or federal grants and federal funding. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug under federal law. It is illegal. And so to bypass or to get through the federal funding for research purposes is extremely difficult. So what do you see as far as research into medical marijuana, its use, etc., when you're trying to figure out, okay, is this good for my patient? Is this good for a specific type of patients? So on and so forth.
I actually have to rely on a lot of international studies. So countries out there that have already legalized it a lot longer than us, they come out with a lot of data for recreational use, medical use. So we have to rely a lot on that. Here in the States, though, we can then rely on some of the more local state related, like, if you're in Oregon, California, they tend to have more robust studies, not as strong as those international studies, but at least some studies.
Anything else that you feel from a medical standpoint is important to kind of know about medical marijuana, at least in your profession as a physician?
And not necessarily medical marijuana, but just marijuana in general, right? So we already know there are different ways that you can take in marijuana, whether that is orally, whether that is patch, edibles, inhalation, and they all come up with different ranges of peaks and durations of effects, right? So these can peak very quickly depending on which modality you use, or they can last a really long time depending on which modality you use. Typically, things that you inhale, things that you smoke will come on more quickly, but they will also dissipate more quickly. So you'll lose the effects more quickly. However, things that you ingest can sometimes take a little longer to take effect, but they can also last in your system for a lot longer. So I think the one thing that I find for some patients and also for friends or people that I know who have used it recreationally is that you fall into this trap where you eat something, you wait an hour and you're like, hey, I don't feel anything. Maybe I should take another. And then it turns into this really compounding effect, which turns into this concern where we might get into the side effects where you may see more issues, concerns, anxiety, psychosis, because they are now compounding, taking more than they probably should have. And instead of waiting the amount of time it needed to take effect, they jumped the gun and took too much. And then now they're really, really in for a ride.
I've definitely heard that from people before that have done it recreationally, where they've said, hey, you know what? Wait the hour, like wait, and then wait a little bit more before you take another one. Cause I guess the impact can be kind of severe when you're taking a lot more than what you thought. And I feel like that's probably with any medication. Either you don't want to take more of a dosage of what you've been prescribed or what's recommended, and you definitely don't want to take it faster than you should. That's just kind of common sense, but I guess people jump the gun a little bit.
You got it right there. Because just like if I were to prescribe you a sleep aid, I would tell you the same instructions. Okay, we're going to start with one tablet. You're going to take it at this time. If you feel like you're not falling asleep with the medication, then we'll give it about 1 to 2 hours before you take your second dose. And I will give very clear instructions. And of course, in the back of my mind, I understand, yeah, you'll probably need this amount, but we're not going to jump right to that amount because I don't know if that might be too much. So I always start with one dose, give it 1 to 2 hours, and then you can take the second dose. So similarly with marijuana, you want to make sure that you do one, maybe give it 2 to 3 hours rather than just 1 or 2 hours, depending on modality that you take it in.
And back to the modality, and again, health concerns, whether it's medical or recreational, I feel like most individuals have grown up knowing you smoke weed, right? You smoke it. But I feel like there's also a detriment to smoking something, because obviously if you smoke cigarettes, you smoke tobacco, you smoke cigars, there's a detriment to your lungs. We understand that recreationally you can smoke it, and that's how most people do it, if not do an ingestible. But from a medical marijuana standpoint, is that the recommended way, or what is the most recommended way to, I guess, get the medical marijuana into your system?
The most recommended way is going to be ingestion, oils, edibles, or via patches, because it is, again, it's more regulated, and we are able to kind of monitor the duration, the effects more consistently versus smoking. Again, waiting on more data to show, but I think long-term use and inhalation can affect the lungs in different ways that we just don't have the data yet to really give out. Just like when we started cigarettes, we didn't realize what it was going to do, cause cancer, until decades later. Similarly to vaping, that was the new a fad thing that everyone got into. And now we're finding out that, hey, it's actually causing a lot of collapsed lungs and sending teenagers into the hospital, into the ICU. And so these are data that we just need more time to figure out and make sure that it's truly safe before.
That was actually gonna be my next question is, with vaping, because obviously that's another way that people are partaking in THC is through a vape pen or a vape.
Mhm.
And with regular vaping, there have been studies and news reports and media reports that have shown that it's extremely harmful and almost as harmful as cigarettes, if not more harmful in their own way. But I also find that interesting that that's something that you mentioned there.
Yeah.
Well, this podcast is not just about the medical side, but it's also about the legal side. And I think this is kind of a good segue to transition into some of the things I see on the legal side with medical marijuana. We've talked about from a medical standpoint being able to prescribe it, in which ways you can prescribe it. But I think that what most people get concerned about is the legality behind medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. And I think there's a lack of understanding as to the state aspect versus the federal aspect. So when it comes down to it, states have the ability to create their own laws regarding drugs and marijuana, but the federal government still has marijuana as a controlled substance. So it's a Schedule 1 drug, and there's a bunch of different, descriptors that make something a Schedule 1 drug. And I think that one of those descriptors is actual medical use. And so it's odd to see that in the health system, a medical use for marijuana, but the federal government still doesn't want to acknowledge the fact from their scheduling of it as a controlled substance as Schedule 1 that it does have medical use. And I think that's a nuance where most people don't understand the difference between federal law and state law and how one can supersede the other based on how our laws are constructed and so on and so forth.
So can you clarify that then? So what if, for example, we have a 21-year-old who bought an edible and, it's
Mhm.
legal in their state. However, maybe it was not prescribed by a physician, but they bought the edible recreationally. Now they go and they get their urine drug screen, or maybe they get pulled over and they get tested, and then the cops find out that it's positive. Are they legally in trouble? Can they just say that they got it medically and maybe show proof that they got a prescription? Are they able to get around that? Or is that because of the federal law, they are going to get booked and get ticketed and fined? How does that work?
Great question. So the best way I would say to explain this is if we start at who the law enforcement agency is that's acting upon that specific pullover, that detainment, whatever you want to call it. If you have a law enforcement agency that's a state or city agency, they have to adhere to the state law. So let's say that you're 21 years old and you are at a party and the cops come in and you have a vape pen with THC in it, but it's legal, right? Well, what does the law in the book say? Do the laws in your state say that you are allowed to carry it in public? Do the laws in your state say that you are only allowed to be at home with it? Do the laws in your state say that you can have it via an edible, but you can't have it via a vape pen? Do the laws in your state say that there's any repercussions for maybe that 21-year-old being around an 18-year-old who's under the age of 21? So there's definitely different laws that you want to consider when it comes to medical marijuana or recreational marijuana. And you want to understand what the laws of your state adhere to. Now, when you look at federal, you look at the Department of Justice and you look at kind of the alphabet soup agencies where you're looking at the DEA, the FBI, the ATF. You have all these agencies that have federal policing power. And unless you are coming before them with something or unless that they conduct a bust, federal agencies probably won't get into the way, right? So, for example, let's say that I'm in a federal courthouse where the federal government has jurisdiction over that courthouse, right? Then you would adhere to federal law. Let's say that you're on a military base and that military base falls under federal jurisdiction. Well, just because something is legal in Colorado, if you're on the military base in Colorado and you have drugs, then you're going to fall under the federal law for drugs, which means they are completely illegal. So it's a nuance there that you kind of have to pay attention to. If somebody commits a crime that's federal, then you bring in these federal agencies that can then tack on other things. So let's look at, criminal organizations. If you are violating federal law in California and the FBI starts investigating you, and all of a sudden they can wrap drug charges into it, even though it might be legal in California, you're still violating federal law. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically what I'm hearing is that we are just small fish, like the fish here is nothing that the federal people need to care about. So that means the next time I see you, I'll probably be sneaking some edibles into your cookie or your brownie because it won't matter.
Well, yeah, but that's also a very big nuance in the legal field, regardless, because law enforcement agencies have discretion. Every police officer out there has the discretion. Every assistant district attorney has a discretion. They can choose whether or not in that moment to let you off with a warning. They can choose whether or not they want to arrest you. An ADA has the decision of whether or not they want to bring a case against you. And so I think in a lot of areas, and especially when it comes to marijuana and the legalities behind it, you have maybe more liberal cities that, even if it's not legal recreationally in their state, the city has a policy that they are not going to pursue crimes that relate to drugs or to marijuana specifically. That, again, is discretion. They have the discretion as to whether or not they really, really, really want to pursue a criminal action against an individual. Now, of course, there's other instances where maybe it's something where they can't turn their back on it. Maybe you've been growing weed in your room and all of a sudden you have an intent to distribute. And even if it's legal in your state, you may not have the proper channel. So you are violating the law. And, you could end up with a drug bust of some sort. Also, there's also the repercussion of if you have smoked or you have ingested an edible and you're driving, well, now you're driving under the influence. So the act may not be that you ingested the weed. The act may be that you have now driven while you were under the influence, which then endangered other people on the road. So there's a lot of discretion and a lot of nuance as to how drugs and marijuana and THC can have impacts on you negatively within the criminal system.
That explanation, I think, clearly tells me why I didn't want to become a lawyer. And that's why you, Nik, are the lawyer, because that is a lot of just like nuances, like you said.
And so this goes without saying, I've never tried a criminal trial, and I've never been involved in criminal law. I've never tried to do legislation. I've never been into politics. So this is just a rudimentary understanding of how it goes. And this might be the same with medicine. In the law, every year there's different legislation that comes out. There's different laws that come out. There's different interpretations of the law, whether it be at the state level or the federal level, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think that's something that's difficult to always keep up with. The law could have been something a few years ago, and then just this year something could happen and the law could completely change. So trying to keep up with the policy and action behind marijuana and medical marijuana can be a little frustrating, I think, for people out there, just like it would be for somebody trying to keep up with the laws of AI or, the laws of intellectual property. Like, things are always changing and things are always coming to the forefront, and interpretations can differ, especially when you look at how society is changing. And I'm sure that's similar to medicine and how you guys practice.
Yeah, obviously there's always new medications, new research, new data that comes out. And specifically in medicine, people don't like it when medicine changes. Then they sometimes can feel like hypocrisy or contradictory to what it was previously. Similarly to smoking, didn't used to be that big of a deal until we found out it was a big deal. And same thing with medication. Sometimes they come out, we find out decades later that there was an issue, it's causing birth defects or things like that, then it starts to become a more relevant issue. But I actually have two questions for you. You may or may not know the answer, but first question, what happens if you are found to have marijuana in your luggage while you're flying? Let's keep it easy. And if we're flying across just from one side of the country to the other. So let's say we're going from California over to Virginia. Is that going to be a federal or state? And which state?
So it depends. The old lawyer answer is it depends. So the airports have generally been seen as a port of entry into the United States or into the country. And so by it being a port of entry, it falls under aspects of federal law, but also falls under aspects of state law. So when you're going into the airport, who are the first individuals that you see trying to get into your gate is TSA agents, right? And I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe TSA falls under the Department of Homeland Security, which is a federal agency. And so when they are going through your luggage, it's my understanding that TSA isn't necessarily looking for drugs or drug paraphernalia. They're looking for bombs and knives and guns and the things that can pose a danger to the people that are in the air. I could be way off on this, but I'm pretty sure that the TSA agents, although they will not pursue any action due to drugs being found, I believe that they have the ability to refer it to the appropriate state channels. For instance, let's say that you're in Las Vegas and you bought gummies, right? Well, rolling around Nevada, rolling around Las Vegas, you're allowed to have those gummies, but now you're trying to fly home. You're trying to fly to Wisconsin, where you're located, where it's not legal. You go through baggage claim and TSA stops you because they realize that you have weed gummies on you. At that point, they might refer you to the local authorities, who would be like Las Vegas PD or, whoever is the police department for the airport. And they might say, hey, it's legal here. You're going to have trouble down the line. Just get rid of them. Right. Or, if a DEA agent is standing right next to you, they might say, this is a federal problem now. TSA caught ya. I'm going to go ahead and pursue this. And now we have a criminal case. When you arrive, right now, you're arriving in Wisconsin, whichever airport it is, and it's illegal there. So let's say that for whatever reason, you're walking by TSA and a bag of gummies falls out of your bag and they pick it up and they look at it. And then at that point, they have the ability to then refer you to the state agency where it's, whatever police department that oversees that airport. And then they could pursue criminal charges for the illegality of the gummies. So again, it's all discretion. It's all who's looking for what. And I believe TSA has put out information saying, hey, we're not looking for the edibles. We're not looking for your vape pen. We're not looking for any of that. But if it comes up, we do have the discretion to refer you to the state authorities. And at that point, you have to deal with the criminal charges of that state. I think you might go a step further if you were sitting on an airplane and you're crossing state lines that enters federal jurisdiction. You start smoking up on the plane or you start passing out edibles on the plane. There can be federal repercussions at that point while you're in the air, that when you land, you may not have the state agency there. You might have a federal agency like the FBI or the DEA sitting there waiting for you upon arrival, and then it becomes a federal criminal action.
Got it. So then to follow up to that question, then would be internationally, would that kind of be similar? Like it would be depending on where you're going to and where you came from. Like if, say, we were to go to Amsterdam.
So if you were to go to Amsterdam, again, there's different jurisdictions. I think what some people fail to note, and maybe it's just the ego of your citizens, is that the laws in your country aren't the same laws as in another country. So for instance, the laws for drunk driving in your country, your state, might be completely different than in another country. So let's say we have country A, which is the United States, and I think the legal limit across the country is 0.08. Now, if you're over 0.08 in a breath test, you're going to get doxxed for driving while intoxicated. But in another country, they may not have that same standard. They may have no laws on the book about drunk driving. So you can get as drunk as you want, get behind the wheel, and there's no criminal liability for that because that's just the laws of that country. So if you were going to Amsterdam, and I think Amsterdam is pretty liberal as far as their drug use and their drug policies, where while you're there, you can go ahead and partake as far as the laws in that area. allow you to do. If you're in the Netherlands, they're going to allow what their countries allow per the law. If you're trying to then get it on the airplane and then get it back to United States, that's where problems come to fruition. Because now, again, you're entering a port of entry. You have to go through customs. You're going through all the federal agencies of the United States. And if you're trying to bring in drugs from outside of the country, then you're falling into the category of, okay, what laws do we have on the books as far as bringing drugs into the country? And then you can get instances of trafficking those drugs, but you're smuggling drugs into the country. And there are more intense laws and repercussions when you're doing something of that nature than if you were probably just flying across the country with something you found in Las Vegas. Now, I think that one thing that people don't consider is what's in their system. And so we think about drug testing. If you were over in Amsterdam and you took all the drugs, right? You took every drug that you possibly could, and you lived to tell a tale about it, and you got back to the United States. Now we're looking at drug testing with your company, with your corporation. And I think that falls into like, what is your company's policy? In aerospace and defense, we were a federal contractor. So even though we had locations throughout the country, there is a policy that federally marijuana is not legal. So our drug policy is zero tolerance for it because we fell under a federal contractor. But if you're in a state like Colorado where it is legal and the company is based in that state and their policy is like, hey, we don't care, then you have nothing to worry about. And I think that's something to consider as far as your professional career goes, or if maybe you're an athlete, maybe you're in a specific profession where you are tested for drug use. There are repercussions that go down the line as far as testing, where you may not bring drugs back into the States, but you can still be tested and there could be repercussions for that.
Got it. Good points. Is there much more that you wanted to add? I feel like this is a kind of a good closing point to get to the end here.
We're probably missing a lot of key factors. I think that things to consider with anything drug related is the infringement on personal rights. You have gun ownership, things that can overlap with marijuana usage. You can have medical discrimination. The instance I saw was an individual, again, federal and state. He was in a state where medical marijuana was legal. He was charged with a federal crime that had nothing to do with the drugs. Well, while he was in federal prison, he wanted his prescribed medical marijuana. And there was some discrepancy as to whether or not he can get that medical marijuana because although it's prescribed by a doctor, it is not acceptable per federal standards. So there's a bunch of different ways to look at it. I think one main thing, and I will always plug our ability to vote. I think that's important in our country. But you have ballot initiatives and you have legislative action. So in certain ways, a ballot initiative allows the people to vote for something that they want. So there are several states where marijuana, whether recreationally or medically, has been put on a ballot and the people have voted on that ballot. And that's how they've gotten the legal marijuana through in their state. But then there's other instances of who you vote for leads to legislative action, bills being passed, other actions being taken to where now you're pushing it through the House and the Senate at the state level or the federal level to get something done. But then again, you go into the whole ties of like, okay, well, it's politics. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. If I'm going to put this through, what am I getting on the back end? And then I think that one thing that we haven't got into is the opioid crisis and big pharma and how that can also impact medical marijuana and its use. So there's a lot of different things. And I think that in the future, bringing in people that are more expert in this field would be beneficial to our viewers and our listeners. But yeah, I just say do your own research. Talk to people about it. Talk to your medical professional about it. Talk to your lawyer about it if you have concerns. And that'd be a good place to start.
And just to piggyback on what Lawyer Nik has mentioned, obviously we are hoping this channel will grow bigger and bigger and bring on more awesome speakers, experts, like he said, so that we can drill. I mean, we can ask questions from a medical standpoint, from a legal standpoint, because I feel like we come up with great questions, and I think we're looking for those great answers. But yeah, so I would say that that's pretty much it for this episode of Medical Legal Brief. where medicine meets law. And if you liked what you heard, share it, rate it, and give us a follow. But let us know if you want us to tackle any specific topics, any questions, or any good ideas out there. And that's it here with Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik.
Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.